Folks, we're not wasting any time today. I have distilled all my previous tuning videos into 2 updated rapid-fire guides that will teach you how to build and tune faster cars in just 10 minutes each. This video is all about the build. First, let's talk general guidelines. You always want to be building cars to the top of a class. Any PI or performance index points below the maximum is wasted performance, so don't leave points on the table. Second, PI is not 100% accurate. Just because 2 cars have the same PI does not mean they are equally as fast. The PI system is a rough approximation that is not affected by tuning, and different cars can simply be better than others within the same class. If you're wondering how much to upgrade a car, generally most cars do best within their stock class or only upgraded by 1 to 2 classes. Upgrading a low class car too much is absolutely possible and can result in a build that's hard to drive and not competitively viable. So don't just max upgrade all your cars. Next, there are always exceptions to the rule. This video will give you guidelines to follow, but is not the end-all be-all. People have different strategies and styles, and the meta is still evolving. Even now, over 3 years after release, top players still spend time experimenting with builds and tunes when trying to push cars to their limit, so you should too. Now let's get into the building process. I always recommend working from the bottom to the top, starting with conversions. Some engine swaps are very powerful. The 6.2 liter V8, Racing V12, or 2-liter inline-4 VVT are among the best to swap in if they're available and in your PI budget. But when in doubt, stick with stock. If it's an option and within your PI budget, the centrifugal supercharger is also one of the best aspiration upgrades you can get. Turbo upgrades can be fine as well if you need to jump up a lot of PI points, but many cars still perform well enough being left NA or with whatever they have stock. This will ultimately come down to your PI budget and what class you're trying to build into. Cars will handle well with their stock drivetrain too, but it's not uncommon to see cars swapped to all-wheel drive in order to gain some handling performance. I recommend beginners to always stick with a car's stock drivetrain, but just know that all-wheel drive swaps can be a good upgrade for some cars. Front-wheel drive cars are competitive up to around A class, but the higher classes are dominated by rear and all-wheel drive. Finally, some cars get wide bodies, which can improve handling and allows you to fit much wider tires, which can be super valuable. However, sometimes these wide bodies increase drag too much and can restrict other aero choices like the ability to adjust front downforce, which is a very powerful tuning tool. So when it comes to wide bodies, it's best to experiment with your options on each build. Aero has 2 important distinctions: adjustable and non-adjustable. Adjustable aero will let you tweak downforce in the tuning menu, and adjustable front aero is one of the best upgrades you can put on your car, especially for higher classes. If you ever see parts that reduce drag, take those, and don't install parts that increase drag. Now, adjustable rear wings can often cost very little or even negative PI, and this does make them very appealing choices for most builds, but in some cases, the increased drag is not worth it. You'll find yourself wanting to run adjustable wings more in the higher classes, but might want to experiment more in the lower classes. Now, tires are a critical component of the build and will be a deciding factor for what class you build into. Stock and street tires can work well for lower classes, but sport tires are almost always bad. Instead, you should be choosing between rally or drift tires for your road racing builds between about B to S1 class. Semi-slicks are also often outclassed by rally and drift tires or by the full racing slicks in the higher classes, although semis do still have more use. Front-wheel drive builds can experiment with running higher grip tires in the lower classes, or even trying drag tires, which do work for some builds. For any rally or off-roading build, off-road race tires are almost always the best choice, with stock tires sometimes working best for classes below B where the PI cost of upgrading is just too high. Rear tire width is almost always worth it. However, front tire width is the exact opposite, and generally should be left stock, especially if you have adjustable front aero. Only upgrade this as a last resort to get more front grip, or if you have PI budget to spare, especially in front-wheel drive builds. Wheel choice and size will affect weight and thus PI, and meta builds will often run heavy, large wheels so that more PI budget can be spent elsewhere. However, the effects here are minor, so I just focus on style and use wheel choice to either add or remove those last few PI points at the end of a build. Track width may also be an option and can be used to adjust the over-understeer balance when you adjust front and rear spacing separately. Wider spacing overall tends to handle better and often costs very few PI, but you can play with this to tweak the handling balance and final PI values. For drivetrain upgrades, your clutch choice depends on the car and your assists. Older, slower cars can benefit greatly from clutch upgrades, but modern sports cars rarely need them. And if you play on the manual plus clutch setting, you should not be upgrading your clutch at all. Only upgrade this if you play on auto or manual clutchless shifting modes. Stock transmissions work well in many newer cars, but the sport upgrade, especially in older cars, is often very cheap or can even drop PI, and it's usually a great choice that unlocks final drive tuning. In some cases where the stock gear ratios are bad or the car only has a 4 or 5 speed gearbox, upgrading to a 6-speed race transmission can be a strong upgrade that also unlocks full gear ratio tuning. Upgrading to more than 7 gears is almost never worth it. The drive shaft is a minor, cheap upgrade that can be used to add those last few PI points if you still have a couple to spare. And you should always upgrade the diff because it's free and unlocks the tune setting. Never use the sport diff, just upgrade to whichever one matches the type of build you're going for. In platform and handling, the brakes are usually a pretty expensive and not very efficient upgrade. Upgrading one level can sometimes be cheap or free though, in which case you should choose that, but race brakes are generally only saved for if you have PI points to spare. It's not the worst upgrade to pick, but usually not the best either. Suspension should almost always be upgraded to race in higher class builds, or rally if you're building an off-road car. But lower class cars often benefit from leaving suspension stock or on sport so that the PI cost can be spent elsewhere. There are also some cases where you may want to run rally suspension on a road car if you need softer spring rates or more suspension travel. A handful of cars also come stock with 4-wheel steering, which gets removed if you upgrade suspension, so those cars should generally be left stock. Front and rear anti-roll bars should always be upgraded to max on every build. These unlock extremely valuable tuning settings and are almost always free to upgrade. Chassis reinforcement is rarely worth it from a meta perspective. It can be used as a form of ballast to allow you to fit other upgrades, but in most cases, the extra weight isn't worth it. That said, this can make some older cars feel much better to drive. So if you want to stiffen up the car, running some chassis reinforcement is fine. Now, weight reduction is where you might need to make a choice with your build. At this point of the process, you'll likely have a good idea of what class you're building the car into, and will know how much of your PI budget you have left. If you've got plenty of budget to spare, then max weight reduction is a no-brainer, as this is a highly valuable upgrade. However, if you're already near the top of the class, then you need to make some choices and find the balance between power upgrades and weight reduction. This is always something that's going to need experimenting and depends heavily on the car and type of racing, but generally real logic applies here, where weight reduction gives you better handling and acceleration, while power upgrades give you more speed for longer straights. So once you've done everything else, it's time to fill out the rest of your PI budget with power upgrades. This is going to take some trial and error and differs greatly depending on the car, what engine and aspiration swaps are available, and how much PI budget you have, but generally I start by prioritizing exhaust, intake, and displacement, then fill extra budget with fuel system, valves, pistons, ignition, and flywheel. I typically save aspiration upgrades for the turbo and superchargers only for if I have a large amount of PI left or am trying to jump up a class, and then I tend to avoid intake manifold, cams, oil and cooling, or intercooler upgrades unless I've got a lot of extra budget to spare. And that's it. At this point, you should have a relatively complete build, and it's time to move on to tuning. But before that, I'll leave you with some final tips. To start, don't forget that small budget upgrades like the flywheel, driveline, and wheel choice can be great tools to fill out or shave off those last few PI points if you're just over or under the maximum for the class. Next, do not underestimate the value of picking the right tires. If you've followed all these steps and are ending up with a car that just still feels too slow, chances are good that you need to change your tire compound. Finally, always feel free to experiment with different balances of power upgrades and weight reduction to find the optimal setup with the best power to weight ratio. This is key for getting the most out of your build, and never be afraid to ask around the community for advice. Most long-timers are always willing to lend a helping hand to anyone willing to listen. Alright folks, be sure to check out the tuning guide next to learn that side of the process, and with that, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.